What's up guys, Jin here. Welcome to my video on how to get fragments by ID. In this video, we'll talk about accessing controls inside the fragment in 3 different ways. Also, do stick around to the end because I'll give you bonus tips on using fragments. By the way, if you are new to this channel, make sure to like and subscribe. I also assume that you already have basic knowledge on SAPUI5. If not, do check out my tutorial series on SAPUI5 for beginners. Links in the description box below. Alright, without further ado, let's jump into it. Before we start, do take note that I will use the old way of loading fragments. This is for backwards compatibility, but the same concept applies for the new API, which is the fragment.load API. So to access a control inside the fragment, we must first understand different ways to load the fragment. So I have a starter project in here, nothing fancy. So I just created a project from a template. And then inside the view or the home view, I just created another file, which is the fragment file.xml. First is loading the fragment with view ID only. So let's have a fragment definition like this. So it contains a simple dialog with the ID my target dialog and also a title hello world, but it doesn't contain any controls inside. Go to your project and run this fragment. The final output should be a simple dialog with the hello world title text. Okay, so let's investigate the controller. So we have the fragment file, and I started to load this fragment by using only the view ID. So in our home controller, when you press the show dialog button, I created a function on press button and created another function just for modularity. And inside that function, I created this definition which loads the fragment file into our current view. So the first parameter in here is the current view ID, and then the second parameter is the namespace of your fragment file, and then last is context or the current controller. And then afterwards, for us to access the dialog, which is my target dialog, you simply use the thisById API and pass the ID of the dialog itself. And then we are able to open that dialog because we have provided the view ID to the XML fragment API. So let's check the output of this ODialog.getID. As you can see, the output is actually the view ID plus the control ID, simply because we only pass the view ID to the fragment definition. Since the fragment is loaded within the view, all reference to the fragment controls will be namespace or auto prefix by the view ID. So in here, you just need to call the thisById API and the dialog ID because it's dependent to the XML fragment. So in here, you just need to pass the dialog ID to the byId API because it's auto prefix using the view ID. So we're done with loading a fragment by providing the view ID, which is the first parameter we provided on our first example. Next is loading a fragment using the fragment ID only. So let's comment out our previous code. And I paste a new source code, so I'll just comment this out. Okay. So this time I'll be using another function called load with fragment ID. So we're still using the same fragment definition from a while ago. So still have that dialog with my target dialog ID and the title still hello world. But this time we are loading the fragment using a different parameter. So the first parameter that we provided is a static text of a fragment ID. So this is the ID that you want to use, any static text that you want. So let's investigate the output of this type of parameter versus the other one, which is the this get view that get ID. The only difference that we have in here is that you cannot use the this by ID API in here because the first parameter you provided is a static text. So now the view doesn't know or doesn't auto prefix using the view ID. Instead, you need another API. You need the fragment that by ID. And then you have the first parameter, which is the fragment ID you provided from a while ago, the second example we have. And then the target or the control ID itself. Notice that the fragment in here is actually an instance from the SAPUI core fragment API. So instead of using the controller or the current context this by ID, we are using the core fragment that by ID API. And also notice that we also have new types of parameters by calling this function. You have your fragment ID and then your target dialog. Okay, so let's try to run this and see the output in our console. If you run the code with the fragment ID, you will notice that the generated ID in the console is directly or not prefixed by the view ID. It's the static text we provided a while ago, and then followed by the control ID. So this is where most of the programmers get confused because they're trying to access a fragment which is loaded from another approach, which is, for example, the approach using the view ID and then using the fragment by ID API, so they cannot get that control inside the dialog because the two contains different namespace or ID prefixing. Okay, so we're done with providing a view ID, and we also tried loading a fragment using the fragment ID. Let's try another approach, which is loading the fragment without providing any IDs at all. So I'll just comment out my old fragment ID function call, and then I also comment out the fragment ID source code. And then I also added a new source code with loading a fragment with no ID parameters. Again, you are still using the same fragment file with the my target dialog and same title hello world, but this time I'm calling the fragment file without providing any first parameter or any IDs. I'll just directly load the fragment file using the path to that fragment and then pass the current context or the controller. So the only difference from the first two now is that you need to access the control inside the dialog using the SAPUI core by ID. So another API, but this is more on a global level because if you don't prefix the controls in a certain fragment, they will be automatically registered to the global or the core level of SAPUI5. So that's why we are using another API, which is the sap.ui.getCore by ID. Okay, so let's try to run this one and investigate the dialog get ID output. So if you run the code with loading a fragment with no ID parameters, you'll get the target dialog or my target dialog ID only because again it will be auto-registered to the core level, so no prefixing is done on the fragment level or done on the view level. So this is the main difference versus the first two approach. The problem in here is that it pollutes your core or SAPUI core level, which might lead to ID collisions or not unique IDs. So it's also related to non-stable IDs because since the my target dialog is not fairly unique compared to the first two, which you have your prefix, most of the time if you have another dialog or another developer name his dialog my target dialog, it will conflict to this one if you have registered both of the dialogs to your UI core. So there you have it. three different approaches for loading an XML fragment or a fragment in SAPUI5. But since you stayed until to the end of this video, I will give you a bonus approach on loading a fragment by combining both the fragment ID and the view ID. So I'll just go up and comment out the load with no ID, and this time I'll be calling another function which I just copy pasted, and inside this function, instead of providing the view ID and the static fragment ID, you actually can use a third API called the thisCreateID, and then pass the static fragment ID to that API, which will will combine the view ID plus the fragment ID. So same parameters, you still load the fragment file, and then the third parameter is the current context. And the only difference by calling the controls inside the fragment is there's an added fragment API that you need to provide. So remember, this function will auto-prefix the view ID plus the fragment ID. So you cannot directly use the this by ID fragment of the controller, but instead you combine it with the second approach, which is the fragment.createID. Okay, so the generated ID from the fragment.createID will be passed to the this by ID, and this will enable you to uniquely access the control inside the dialog. Okay, so let's try to run this source code. Okay, so if you run the view ID plus fragment ID, you will see that the first segment of our ID is the view ID level. Then the fragment ID or the static fragment ID that we created is actually prefixed together with it before the control ID, my target dialog. So this is far more complicated in a sense, but it's more secure in terms of generating stable IDs, because this will definitely prevent you from encountering the duplicate ID error, since you have two common prefixing on top of your target control. Okay. So this is the combination of step 1 and approach 1 and approach 2. So my tip in here is use this if you have a very complex application, just in case there are multiple dialogues sharing with the same ID. I don't know why you will do that, but in some cases developers do that. So this is a way to prevent ID collision, and also this also prevent the UI core pollution, because so in a way this also prevents the UI core problem, because you still have the auto prefixing, which is a more secure approach because you combine the fragment level and the view level. But as you can see, the code is much longer because you need to use the create ID API for the view and the create ID API from the fragment as well. Okay, so personally for me, I will generally use the first approach, which is just providing the view ID, because I think the length of the view ID is enough, or the auto prefixing done by the view ID is enough to avoid ID collision. But in some cases, if you really need to have very specific IDs and you don't want to have those duplicate ID errors, you can use this view ID plus fragment ID approach. So there you have it, 4 different approach on loading controls or accessing controls inside the fragment. Just the general tip in here is just to remember how you load the fragment versus how you will access the controls inside it. So it's highly dependent on what prefixing you are using, or if you don't use prefixing at all. So other approach may appeal to you, especially when dealing to large applications, or in cases the namespace is likely to conflict with other fragments. So make sure do check other developer source code first, or how they loaded their fragment and how can you access those fragments on runtime. I highly discourage using the core approach, which is you don't pass any ID at all, since this will pollute the global level of your application. So duplicate ID error is there's a high probability it will happen since you register the fragment on the core level. So I hope you learned something about this video. How about you? Which approach do you use the most, or do you use any of this approach? Or any question with regards to the different approach that we discussed in this video? So please leave a comment below. Also, don't forget to subscribe for more tips and tricks on SAPUI5. So there you have it. Until next time, see you guys.